Welcome to I Got Stuck, a catalog of temporary obsessions with me, your host, Dr. Kelly Reedy, wherein each week I'll give you a full report on the latest topic that's kept me up at night. Things that have led to countless hours of procrastination through Googling, asking Jeeves, and navigating the twistiest and turniest of internet rabbit holes. By the way, rabbit holes are technically called warrens, and they can be so elaborate that they even have their own traffic circles. The Olympics are happening right now, and I'm really not that interested in them, with the exception of two things: the 1900 Olympics and the 1904 Olympics. Both were incredibly poorly executed near-death experiences for some athletes, and right now I want to focus on the worst of the worst event of them all, the marathon. I searched for Olympics marathon last night, 8 hours before the men's Olympic marathon started. And what popped up was the Olympic marathon course is a torture test. That's by design, says the New York Times. And it's the most hellish marathon in Olympic history, says the Wall Street Journal. And to that I say, maybe. Today, I'm going to tell you about what was the actual most hellish marathon in Olympic history. And that might change this weekend. We'll see. But I want to tell you about the worst one and how we as humans got there. So let's start by going back in time to the origins of the modern marathon. The origin story of the marathon is maybe just a myth, but legend goes that in ancient Greece, 490 BC to be specific, a Greek messenger named Philippides had to travel from the city of Marathon to the city of Athens to announce that the Greeks defeated the Persians in the Battle of Marathon. He had to run as quickly as possible to announce the victory for a really dramatic reason. And again, this is according to myth, according to legend. Athenians would have been preparing to burn their own city and murder their own women and children if they suspected they lost, because they didn't want the Persians to invade and do the murdering themselves. So getting the message to them was a really urgent task. Philippides ran the distance, which was around 40 kilometers or 25 miles. He took off his clothes somewhere along the way, and he collapsed and died from exhaustion just after delivering the message that they had, in fact, won. The origin of the modern marathon goes back to 1894. And I want to give some background on the modern Olympic Games in order to tell you about the origin of the modern marathon. And by the way, I'm throwing around the term modern here a lot. What I mean by it is non-ancient. Specifically in this context, it means 1894 and later. The first modern Olympics were held in 1896 in Athens, Greece, and were inspired by the ancient Olympics, which were held in Olympia, Greece, around 2,000 years ago. There had been some efforts to do modern versions of the Olympics in the late 1800s, but none worked out until the 1896 one because of a lack of worldwide communication, which, to be fair, sounds like a pretty tough thing to do, especially in the 1800s. But a guy named Pierre de Coubertin figured it out. He organized what was basically an Olympic Congress. It was a meeting of delegates from lots of countries. Not all the countries, of course, but it was the best effort up to that point. It happened at the Sorbonne in 1894, and between the delegates themselves and people who just wanted to come to watch a meeting, 2,000 people showed up. The biggest result of this meeting was that the International Olympic Committee was created, and I'm going to refer to that as the IOC for the rest of this. And the IOC organized the aforementioned first modern Olympic Games, which took place in Athens in the summer of 1896. The next one was in Paris in the summer of 1900, and it was bananas. It deserves its own story, and it's my favorite. But what I'll say about it for now is that it was part of the 1900 World's Fair, and it was overshadowed by that, and it really just spiraled out of control. And the same thing kind of happened for the next Olympics in 1904. It was in St. Louis. It was also part of the World's Fair. And the World's Fair was the main attraction. The other problem with that one was that it had mostly Americans competing, so it really missed the whole international spirit of the thing. And then after 10 years of really not doing great, working out the kinks, the 1908 Summer Olympics really got the ball rolling. The Olympics eventually came back to Paris in 1924, and the whole thing was way more successful than that time in 1900. But success is not what I want to talk about right now. I want to talk about the modern marathon. The modern marathon was the idea of a French linguist named Michel Breal. After that initial meeting in 1894 about the first modern Olympic Games, Michel Breal wrote a letter to the organizer and said, "Since you are going to Athens, see if we can organize a marathon race. This would have an antique flavor. If we knew how long the Greek warrior took, we could set the distance." Before that idea came up, the IOC had already decided not to have any races longer than 1,500 meters because some people said that distances that long were contrary to the principles of sport and hygiene, which I think I agree with. So if, like me, you're not excited about the idea of marathons, blame this linguist, Michel Breal. And of course, the IOC took his idea and ran with it. There wasn't a precise distance at first. It was just a race to get from point A to point B. In the 1896 Olympics, that was a location in Marathon to a location in Athens. In the next few Olympics, it was just two convenient points that were somewhere in the 25-mile ballpark from each other. The distance that's now standard, 26.2 miles, comes from the 1908 London Olympics. The specific distance is what it is, supposedly, because Queen Alexandra wanted the race to start on the lawn of Windsor Castle so the little royal kids could watch from their little royal nursery window. And she wanted it to end in front of the royal box at the Olympic Stadium. And that distance was measured to be 26.2 miles. It was officially standardized in 1921, so the first Olympics that used that distance after its standardization was the one that took place 100 years ago in Paris. But that first one, it was hot. It was on dusty dirt roads. And the guy who won, a 23-year-old Greek shepherd named Spiridon Lewis, stopped halfway through to eat an egg and drink a glass of wine. And when he crossed the finish line, the crowd went wild. Pierre de Coubertin said, "The excitement and the enthusiasm were simply indescribable. One of the most extraordinary sights that I can remember." Originally, it looked like all top three finishers were Greek, but the third place guy was disqualified because he caught a ride in a carriage for part of the race. But the winner never ran another race again. He just went back to farm life as a national hero. So overall, the first modern marathon was pretty successful. But then came 1900. Paris in the summer. It was blazing hot. The running path was along the path of the old city wall, which is a nice idea, but the old city wall was only sort of marked and only in some places. Runners were getting lost and having to double back on the route, which used a ton of their time. And in fact, it was so confusing that the guy who placed fifth said that nobody had passed him for the entire race, which I think is absolutely hilarious. Except that it wasn't hilarious for the guy who won that race, a guy named Michel Théato. He was a bakery delivery boy in Paris, so he knew the layout of the city really well. And because of what the fifth place guy claimed, Michel Théato was accused of taking shortcuts, and he didn't get his medal until 12 years later when those allegations were finally disproved. Overall, only 6 of the 13 competitors actually finished the race, and that was probably due to the heat. But amazingly, that's all that happened. The 1900 marathon wasn't actually all that bad or crazy, relatively speaking. Just some people running around in circles when they weren't supposed to, and then the people not finishing the race. But now, let's fast forward to the next Olympics, the 1904 Olympics in St. Louis, for the worst marathon ever. A Bored Panda article about it really nailed it with their headline. The 1904 Olympic Marathon was more gruesome than the Hunger Games, and every athlete had it worse than the other. Just like the Paris one, it was really hot, and just like the one in Greece, it was really dusty. 32 competitors started the race, and only 14 finished, so fewer than half. The only official water source along the route was a fresh water well around 12 miles in, so that made the race pretty dangerous. The organizer apparently was conducting research in purposeful dehydration. One race official said that the course was the most difficult a human being was ever asked to run over. There were hills, there were rocks in the road, there was traffic, there were trains, wagons, dog walkers. And not only did runners have to be aware of and be able to dodge all those things, but all those things stirred up the dust in the road even more. And from what I can tell, the dust combined with the lack of water was the main problem. Okay, now buckle up. Make sure you're sitting down because I'm going to give you a rundown. A rundown of what happened to some of these guys. First up, William Garcia. William Garcia collapsed 8 miles from the finish line after the dust had coated his esophagus, ripped his stomach lining, and caused hemorrhaging. I'll say that again. The dust had coated his esophagus, ripped his stomach lining, and caused hemorrhaging. He spent several days in the hospital, but amazingly, he survived. Next up, there were 2 participants from South Africa in the race, Lynn Taunyani and Jan Mashiani. Taunyani was chased a whole mile off course by a wild dog. Still, he finished the race. He finished in 9th place, which is pretty amazing, and Mashiani came in 12th. Up next, we have Felix Carvajal, a mail carrier who came to the U.S. from Cuba by way of New Orleans. The story goes that he lost all his money in a dice game in New Orleans, and he had to hitchhike from New Orleans to St. Louis. He showed up at the marathon at the very last minute wearing regular old street clothes. He was wearing regular street shoes, a long-sleeved shirt, long dark pants, and even a beret. But luckily, somebody found some scissors and cut the bottom of his pants off right before the race started. The local paper was the St. Louis Dispatch, and they had a car they were driving around the route. They reported about Carvajal that they passed the little Cuban 3 miles out, still running at an even gait, and he waved his cap and yelled enthusiastically. So, strong start, but then sometime during the race, he ran past an apple orchard and decided to take a snack break because supposedly he had not eaten in something like 40 hours. So, in this apple orchard, he ate some apples, but they turned out to be rotten. And he started having really bad stomach cramps. So, he laid down and he took a nap in the middle of the Olympic marathon. But amazingly, he finished the race. He didn't just finish the race, he finished in 4th place. So that tells you something about how the other guys fared, that the guy who took a nap along the way came in 4th. Cramps didn't just hit Felix Carvajal, they also hit Sam Mellor, who was in the lead for a while. While Carvajal took a nap and then got back to work, Sam Mellor did what I probably would have done. He eventually just stopped running. An American named John Lorden started vomiting at some point, and he also just gave up. And then there's Fred Lors, who collapsed from dehydration around the 9th mile of the race and then hitched a ride in a car that he planned to take to the finish line. But the car broke down at mile 19, and Lors got out and ran the last 5 miles of the race. When he crossed the finish line, the crowd went wild because he had won. He was going along with the whole thing, too. When he got his picture taken with Alice Roosevelt and he was about to be handed the gold medal, somebody who had seen him earlier said, "Hey, wait, that's that guy that took that car." And then Fred Lors, busted, smiled and said, "Oh, I was only joking. I never intended to actually accept the medal." But then he got banned for life because nobody believed him. So who actually won this race? The man that won this race was a British-born American clown named Thomas Hicks. Like everybody else, he had a rough time in the race. He started showing signs of exhaustion around mile 10. At that time, it was legal for runners to be coached and helped by race officials along the route. When Thomas Hicks started to feel really bad, he came across 2 men who became his support team for the rest of the race. They refused to give him water, but they did sponge his mouth out with warm distilled water. I don't know how supportive that was when they could have just given him some water to drink, but it gets worse and it gets weirder. When he was 7 miles from the end and really not doing well, these guys gave him a mix of strychnine and raw egg whites. Strychnine is, of course, a rat poison and a great rock and roll song, but in small doses, strychnine acts as a stimulant. So this was the first use of performance-enhancing drugs in the Olympics that we know of. And of course, there were no rules about things like that then, so this was totally legal and also totally not his idea. Thomas Hicks drank the egg whites and strychnine, but the so-called support team must have given him too much, because by the last couple miles, Hicks had grown ashen and limp. But then when he heard that Lours got disqualified, meaning he still had a chance to win, he got a little pep in his step and he started running a little better. The support team gave him more strychnine and egg whites, and this time they turned it up a notch by having him wash it down with brandy. Nothing like rat poison, raw eggs, and brandy together in your stomach on a 100-degree day. And then after that, they dumped some warm water on him. Here's what one of those race officials wrote. Over the last 2 miles of the road, Hicks was running mechanically, like a well-oiled piece of machinery. His eyes were dull, lusterless. The ashen color of his face and skin had deepened. His arms appeared as weights well tied down. He could scarcely lift his legs, while his knees were almost stiff. Not surprisingly, Thomas Hicks started to hallucinate during the last mile. He hallucinated the worst, scariest possible thing. He hallucinated that he still had 20 miles left in the race. And he begged for food, he begged to lie down, but they just gave him more brandy and eggs. I think they cooled it on the strychnine after the hallucination started, but more brandy, more eggs. And he was really doing it. He made it to the stadium, and his trainers had to pretty much carry him across the finish line. But his feet were touching the ground, so it counted. Thomas Hicks, the clown, won the race. He won with a time of 3 hours and 28 minutes, which is the longest winning marathon time in Olympic history. Not just by a few minutes, but by something like 30 minutes. For context, the men's Olympic marathon that just happened today, the day I'm recording this, the winner was an Ethiopian runner who finished in 2 hours and 6 minutes. And remember, this year's Paris course is supposed to be the most hellish Olympic marathon course ever. And the guy who won today still finished an hour and 20 minutes faster than the guy in 1904. So in 1904, Thomas Hicks, the clown, finished in 3:28, and then he collapsed. It took 4 doctors a whole hour to get him to the point where he could even leave the stadium. But he did, and he continued running. Not that day, of course. I mean, like in life. And in fact, he went on to win the Chicago Marathon in 1906. And the guy who cheated, Fred Lours, went on to win the Boston Marathon the very next year. So just to recap some of the standout moments from the 1904 Olympic Marathon. A ripped stomach lining, a wild dog, rotten apples, cramps, vomit, dehydration, hitchhiking, brandy, strychnine, and of course, eggs. So there you have it, the 1904 Olympic Marathon won by a hallucinating, rat-poisoned clown. Since 1904, marathons have calmed down and are thankfully way less chaotic. Even the kind of unmarked 1900 one in Paris looks like a cakewalk compared to 1904. And today, 120 years later, as I mentioned, was the men's Olympic marathon, and the women's is tomorrow. So by the time you hear this, we'll know how everybody did. Former Olympian Ed Eyestone predicted this marathon will have a debris field in the final miles. The New York Times called this certainly the most difficult marathon course in the history of the Games. And that's probably true if you consider just the course itself. If you don't consider the other factors of 1904, like the dehydration and the dust and the heat. The thing about this year's course is that it's hilly. Not only are the inclines tough, and there are a lot of them, but they're also really long. The first big hill has the same incline as the Boston Marathon's Heartbreak Hill, but it's twice as long. One of the coaches said, it's really hard to imagine how extreme the course is without running it. The course is unlike any major marathon these athletes have ever run. And when that same coach saw a video of somebody running up one of the hills in the course, he said, it doesn't look like you'd run up that. It's just comical. And I think there's only one thing to say about that, and that is send in the clowns, like Thomas Hicks. And this is where I'll leave you. I hope you enjoyed this inaugural episode of I Got Stuck as much as I enjoyed getting stuck and telling you about it. Subscribe and stay tuned for another episode soon. And please let me know if you have a suggestion for some mental quicksand I could get myself into next time. Thanks for listening. Stay curious and don't run down dusty roads in 100-degree weather without bringing your own water supply. This theme song was written and recorded by Clark Blomquist.